On the day my husband passed away, I said nothing about the $28 million he left behind, and nothing about the second document locked in his private safe. The hospital room still smelled faintly of antiseptic and overbrewed coffee when the doctor quietly confirmed what I already knew. Edward Whitmore, my husband of 42 years, was gone. I held his hand for a long moment after the machines were silenced, memorizing the weight of it, the stillness of it, the finality. Across the room, my son Daniel cleared his throat and stepped into the hallway to make calls. Vanessa, my daughter-in-law, pressed a tissue to her dry eyes and began whispering about arrangements before his side of the bed had even cooled. I noticed everything. I always do. I just didn't react. Grief is loud for some people. For me, it is quiet, measured, observant. By the time we arrived back at the house in Weston, the late afternoon sun was cutting long shadows across the marble foyer Edward had insisted on installing 20 years ago. 6 bedrooms, 9,000 square feet. Too large, Vanessa had once said, for just old people. I remember that. I remember everything. The casseroles began arriving before sunset. Neighbors, colleagues, distant cousins. I stood near the fireplace greeting them, accepting condolences with a steady nod. Daniel hovered near the staircase, checking his phone between handshakes. Vanessa stayed close to him, her hand resting lightly on his arm as if to signal ownership of something larger than comfort. At one point, I overheard her murmur, "We'll need to schedule the will reading quickly. There are tax windows to consider." Not tomorrow. Not next month. Quickly. I turned toward the portrait of Edward above the mantel and allowed myself the smallest breath of something that might have been amusement. 2 nights earlier, Edward had called me into his study. He was pale but lucid, sitting behind the mahogany desk where he had built Whitmore Logistics from a 3-truck operation into a national firm. "Margaret," he had said, sliding a sealed envelope across the desk, "don't say anything right away. Let them show you who they are." I didn't ask what he meant. After 4 decades of marriage, I understood his pauses better than most people understand words. The envelope had joined another document already resting inside the wall safe, behind the framed sailing certificate no one ever looked twice at. I knew the combination. Vanessa did not. Back in the living room, someone asked me if I needed water. I declined. My hands were steady. Vanessa approached with a softness in her voice that felt recently practiced. "Margaret, you must be exhausted. Daniel and I can help manage the estate paperwork. It might be overwhelming for you." Overwhelming. The word floated between us like a polite insult. I looked at her carefully styled hair, her pearl earrings, the faint impatience behind her expression. "Thank you," I said calmly. "I'll let you know." She smiled, but it didn't reach her eyes. Later that evening, when most of the guests had gone and the house finally quieted, Daniel joined me in the kitchen. He avoided looking directly at me. "Dad had things organized, right?" he asked. "Investments, accounts?" I folded a dish towel and placed it precisely on the counter. "Your father was very organized," I replied. "That was all." He nodded, relief passing across his face too quickly. They thought my silence meant confusion, or shock, or fragility. They mistook composure for weakness. Upstairs, in the bedroom Edward and I had shared for 42 years, I sat at the edge of the bed and removed my earrings slowly, deliberately. On the dresser rested a photograph from our 40th anniversary cruise along the Maine coast. The wind in my hair, his arm around my waist. He had always believed in contingency plans, in reading people carefully, and waiting until the precise moment to act. I opened the nightstand drawer and retrieved the small brass key he had given me the previous week. I did not cry. Not yet. Instead, I listened to the faint murmur of Daniel and Vanessa downstairs discussing next steps and asset structure. I allowed them their confidence. I allowed them their assumptions. In the quiet of that room, with the house settling around me and the future shifting into place, I made one simple decision. I would wait. I would watch. And when the time came, I would speak exactly once. The house felt different the morning after Edward passed away. Not emptier exactly, but rearranged in a way that had nothing to do with furniture and everything to do with intention. I woke before sunrise, as I always had during our marriage, and lay still for several minutes listening to the unfamiliar silence beside me. No steady breathing, no rustle of newspaper pages, just the faint hum of the heating system pushing warm air through 9,000 square feet of carefully designed space. I rose, smoothed the comforter with deliberate care, and walked downstairs barefoot, my reflection following me in the tall hallway mirrors Vanessa once suggested we replace with something more modern. In the kitchen, I brewed coffee the way Edward liked it, 2 level tablespoons of dark roast for every 6 ounces of water, though there was no one left to drink it but me. Habit is a form of loyalty. I poured a single cup and stood at the wide window overlooking the half-acre backyard, the winter grass pale to meet the thin layer of frost. By 7:30, Daniel and Vanessa were already awake. I heard cabinet doors opening more briskly than usual, their voices low but purposeful. When they entered the kitchen, they did not look like children who had lost a father. They looked like executives preparing for a meeting. Daniel kissed my cheek lightly. "Mom, we should start organizing documents today. Dad would have wanted things efficient." Efficient. Vanessa nodded in agreement. She wore a cream sweater and tailored slacks, as if professionalism might accelerate inheritance. "There are deadlines with estates this size," she added gently. "Capital gains, transfer structures, it can get complicated." I sipped my coffee and considered the word complicated. Edward had spent months ensuring it was not. "Your father prepared thoroughly," I said. "We will follow his plan." That seemed to satisfy Daniel. It did not satisfy Vanessa. Her eyes scanned the kitchen island where Edward often sorted paperwork. "Do you know where he kept the updated portfolio statements?" she asked, casual but precise. I set my cup down on its saucer and wiped an invisible drop from the counter. "Yes," I replied. Nothing more. After breakfast, Daniel disappeared into his father's study. I watched from the hallway as he opened desk drawers that had not yet had time to miss their owner. Vanessa joined him a few minutes later, closing the door softly behind her. I did not need to hear their conversation to understand its direction. The study had always been Edward's domain. Dark wood shelves, leather chair, framed photographs from trade conferences in Chicago and Seattle. It now felt like contested territory. I walked past the closed door and continued toward the back staircase, my steps unhurried. Inside the master bedroom closet, hidden behind a row of winter coats, was the small digital safe Edward had installed years ago. I entered the code without hesitation. The soft click of release echoed in the quiet room. Inside rested 2 folders. The first contained the public documents Daniel expected. The second contained the trust amendment dated 3 weeks earlier, signed, notarized, and explicit. I touched the edge of that second folder only briefly before closing the safe again. Timing mattered. Downstairs, I heard the study door open. Vanessa's tone carried faint frustration. "There is nothing recent in here," she said. Daniel responded with something I could not fully hear, but the word attorney drifted clearly down the hall. I descended the staircase slowly, meeting them as they emerged. "I will call Mr. Caldwell this afternoon," I said evenly. "The will reading can be scheduled for early next week." Daniel nodded, relief returning. Vanessa offered a thin smile. "That sounds wise." Wise. I noticed how often she chose words that implied I might not be. Throughout the day, sympathy calls continued. Flower deliveries arrived. I thanked each caller with the same measured voice. Meanwhile, Daniel and Vanessa remained in motion, as if stillness might threaten momentum. They discussed property valuation at the dining table, where Edward and I had hosted Thanksgiving dinners for decades. They speculated about restructuring the business division that carried Daniel's name. I listened. I stored every inflection, every assumption. By evening, as the winter sky deepened to navy, and the porch lights cast long golden beams across the driveway, Vanessa approached me once more. "Margaret," she began softly, "you do not have to manage this alone." I met her gaze steadily. "I am not alone," I replied, and for the first time, she looked uncertain. The will reading was scheduled for the following Tuesday at 11 in the morning at Caldwell & Pierce on Boylston Street, a firm Edward had trusted for more than 20 years. The morning arrived cold and bright, the kind of sharp New England winter day that makes everything look precise and unforgiving. Daniel drove separately, Vanessa seated beside him in their silver sedan, while I chose to take the black town car Edward had used for business meetings. I watched the city pass through the tinted window, brick buildings and bare trees standing motionless against a pale blue sky. Grief has a way of narrowing the world, but that morning my vision felt unusually clear. Inside the law office, the conference room was quiet, polished, controlled. A long mahogany table stretched across the center, surrounded by high-backed leather chairs. Mr. Caldwell greeted me with a steady handshake and a look that suggested he understood more than he intended to say. Daniel sat to my right. Vanessa positioned herself slightly forward, her folder neatly arranged, pen ready. Preparation is a form of expectation. Mr. Caldwell began reading the primary will in a measured, neutral tone. The estate was valued at approximately $28 million, inclusive of business holdings, real estate, liquid assets, and diversified investments. I saw Daniel inhale slowly at the confirmation of the number, as if hearing it spoken aloud made it more real. The majority share of Whitmore Logistics was assigned to Daniel, with structured oversight for 5 years. The Weston property was to remain within the family. Several charitable contributions were specified. And then there was my allocation, generous by most standards, yet strategically framed. Vanessa remained still, but her fingers tightened slightly around her pen when she heard the structure of the business control. It was not immediate. It was conditional. Mr. Caldwell continued without interruption. Upon conclusion, he closed the folder calmly. "These are the terms of the will as executed last year," he said. Last year. I noticed the subtle emphasis. Daniel leaned back in his chair, relief softening his posture. Vanessa offered a gentle smile in my direction. "Edward was always thoughtful," she said. Thoughtful. The word lingered in the room. I nodded once. Yes, he was. There were a few procedural clarifications regarding probate timelines and reporting requirements. Daniel asked practical questions about operational transition. Vanessa inquired about tax implications with an attentiveness that felt rehearsed. I observed. I did not correct assumptions. I did not volunteer information. Silence can be mistaken for surrender by those who are impatient. When the meeting concluded, Daniel stood and placed a hand briefly on my shoulder. "Mom, we will handle the business side so you do not have to worry," he said, his voice earnest but distracted. Vanessa added softly, "You deserve to rest now." Rest. The implication settled between us. I thanked Mr. Caldwell for his time and requested a private word before leaving. Daniel and Vanessa stepped into the hallway, their conversation low but animated. Inside the room once more, Mr. Caldwell met my gaze directly. "You understand the structure," he said quietly. "I do," I replied, "and we will proceed exactly as Edward intended." He gave a small nod. There was no need for further explanation. When I stepped into the hallway, Vanessa stopped speaking mid-sentence. Daniel looked at me expectantly. "Everything is settled for now," I said evenly. Outside, the winter air felt sharper than before. As we walked toward the Mirage, Vanessa slipped her arm through Daniel's and began discussing strategic improvements for the company, as if authority had already shifted. I listened without comment. They believed the future had unfolded neatly in their favor. They believed the final chapter had been read. I opened the door to my car and paused briefly before stepping inside. Timing is not about haste. It is about precision, and precision requires patience. The atmosphere inside the Weston house shifted subtly after the will reading, not with confrontation, but with confidence. Daniel began spending long hours in his father's study, reviewing operational reports and making calls to senior managers at Whitmore Logistics. His tone changed when he spoke on the phone, firmer, faster, during departments and modernizing branding. I watched them from the hallway more than once, their heads bent together over spreadsheets at the same desk where Edward had once mapped out expansion routes across 3 states using nothing but a yellow legal pad and a pencil. Efficiency had replaced patience. Ambition had replaced stewardship. One afternoon, as I arranged fresh lilies in the dining room, Vanessa joined me with a folder tucked neatly against her side. "Margaret," she began, in that careful, measured tone she favored. "Daniel and I were thinking about long-term planning. This house is beautiful, but it is a great deal for one person to manage." I trimmed a stem and placed it precisely into the vase before responding. "I have managed it for 20 years, I said calmly. She smiled, but there was a calculation behind it. "Of course, but perhaps something smaller would be more practical. A luxury condominium in Back Bay, maybe. Less upkeep, more security." Security. The implication was subtle, but clear. I met her gaze steadily. "This house was Edward's vision," I replied, "and mine." She nodded, as if conceding the point, but I could see the shift in her posture. The conversation was not finished. That evening, Daniel approached me with a similar softness. "Mom, Vanessa is only trying to make sure you are comfortable. You do not need all this space." I folded the napkin I had been holding and placed it beside my plate. "Comfort is not measured in square footage," I said quietly. He looked uncertain, caught between loyalty and momentum. In the days that followed, I noticed small changes. The household staff began receiving instructions from Vanessa about scheduling. The landscaping company was asked to provide updated property valuations. Daniel requested copies of maintenance contracts and insurance policies. None of it was improper. None of it was overtly disrespectful. It was simply early. Premature authority often reveals impatience. One morning, I entered the study while they were reviewing financial projections. The conversation stopped mid-sentence. Vanessa straightened. "We were just discussing cash flow optimization," she said brightly. I walked toward the bookshelf and ran my fingers along the spines of Edward's leather-bound journals. "Your father believed in long-term stability," I said without turning around. "He did not favor rapid changes." Daniel hesitated. "The market is different now," he replied. "It requires agility." Agility. I nodded slowly. Agility without foresight can be costly. Silence followed. I left the room without raising my voice, without asserting control. I did not need to. Later that afternoon, alone in the master bedroom, I retrieved the brass key from the nightstand and opened the digital safe once more. The second folder remained untouched, its contents precise and deliberate. The amendment was clear. Any attempt to force asset liquidation or coerce relocation of the surviving spouse would trigger a complete restructuring of control under the private trust Edward had established. I closed the safe gently and returned the key to its place. Downstairs, Vanessa laughed at something Daniel had said, her voice light and confident. They believed they were preparing the future. They did not realize the future had already been prepared for them. I walked to the window overlooking the driveway and watched as the late afternoon light settled across the stone facade. Patience is not passivity. It is timing refined by experience. And I had no intention of rushing what was already unfolding. The following week unfolded with a quiet acceleration that would have impressed Edward had he been alive to observe it. Daniel began arriving home later each evening, his jacket draped over his arm, his expression sharpened by new responsibility. Vanessa adapted even faster. She scheduled meetings with financial advisors without consulting me and requested updated appraisals for the Weston property under the pretense of insurance adjustments. The appraiser walked through the house one Tuesday morning with a clipboard and a laser measuring device, pausing in the foyer to calculate ceiling height, as if the history contained within those walls could be reduced to square footage. I accompanied him politely, answering questions about renovations and original construction dates. Vanessa hovered nearby, offering additional details in a tone that suggested ownership rather than assistance. When the appraiser left, she turned to Daniel and said, "It is a strong seller's market right now. If we reposition strategically, the timing could be ideal." I folded my hands in front of me and asked evenly, "Reposition what, exactly?" She did not hesitate. "The asset portfolio." Asset. The word echoed against the marble floors. Later that afternoon, Daniel requested a family discussion in the dining room. The same long table that had hosted birthday dinners and graduation celebrations now held neatly stacked folders and a printed market analysis. "Mom," he began carefully, "we have been reviewing liquidity structures. A portion of the real estate equity could be redeployed into higher yield opportunities." I studied his face. He looked convinced. Vanessa placed a hand lightly on his arm. "We just want to maximize growth while you are still able to enjoy it," she said, her voice warm but firm. I considered the phrasing. While you are still able. There it was again. Age disguised as concern. "Your father did not build stability by chasing yield," I replied calmly. "He built it by anticipating risk." Daniel exhaled, frustration flickering briefly across his features. "The world is changing," he said. "We have to adapt." I rose from my chair without raising my voice. "Adaptation without consent is overreach," I said softly. The room fell quiet. That evening, I requested a private meeting with Mr. Caldwell at his office. I did not inform Daniel or Vanessa. The drive into Boston was steady, traffic moderate along the Massachusetts Turnpike. Inside the familiar conference room, I placed my handbag on the table and removed the second folder. Mr. Caldwell read through the amendment slowly, his expression unwavering. "The conditions are explicit," he said finally. "Any attempt to pressure asset liquidation or force relocation activates full control under the private trust." I nodded. "And documentation?" I asked. He opened a secondary file. "We have recorded communications and signed acknowledgments from your husband confirming his concerns. The language is precise." Precise. That word mattered. I returned home just after sunset. The driveway lights illuminated the stone exterior with the same quiet dignity they always had. Inside, Daniel and Vanessa were seated in the study, reviewing projected sale values. Vanessa looked up as I entered. "We were just discussing timelines," she said brightly. I placed my gloves on the desk and regarded them both evenly. "There will be no discussion of selling this house," I said. My tone did not rise. It did not need to. Daniel blinked. "Mom, we are only exploring options." I met his gaze steadily. "Explore all you wish. Act on nothing." Vanessa's smile faltered. Just slightly. She recovered quickly. "Of course," she replied. But I saw the calculation shift behind her eyes. They believed they were steering the future. They did not yet understand that the steering mechanism had already changed hands, and I was prepared to let them continue believing otherwise for just a little longer. The shift happened 3 days later, not with raised voices or dramatic confrontation, but with a spreadsheet. Vanessa left her laptop open on the kitchen island while she stepped outside to take a call. I was seated at the far end of the counter with a cup of tea, reviewing correspondence from the foundation Edward had supported for years. I do not make a habit of invading privacy, but numbers displayed in bold tend to command attention. Across the screen, I saw a projected timeline titled Strategic Asset Realignment. Beneath it, a column labeled Weston Property Liquidation Quarter 2. The suggested listing price was precise to the dollar. Below that, a section marked Transitional Housing Plan for Surviving Spouse. Surviving spouse. Not Margaret, not mother. A category, a line item. I did not move closer. I did not touch the keyboard. I simply read what was visible from where I sat. The outline detailed estimated proceeds from a sale, reallocation percentages into aggressive growth funds, and a proposed condominium purchase capped at 1,200 square feet. Efficient, contained, manageable. I heard the back door close and returned my attention to my tea just as Vanessa re-entered, her expression composed. She glanced at the screen briefly, then at me. "Daniel and I are just exploring possibilities," she said smoothly. I nodded once. "Exploration is harmless," I replied. "Implementation is not." She studied my face as if searching for cracks. There were none. That evening, after dinner, Daniel joined her in the study, and the door closed with soft finality. Their voices were low but animated. I walked upstairs to the master bedroom and opened the closet safe once more. The Second Amendment rested where I had left it, its language exact and measured. I retrieved my phone and placed a call to Mr. Caldwell. He answered on the second ring. "I believe the triggering conditions may be approaching," I said calmly. There was no need for elaboration. "Understood," he replied. "Would you like to proceed with formal notice?" I paused briefly, considering timing, tone, impact. "Not yet," I said. "Prepare the documentation. We will act at the appropriate moment." The next morning, Daniel requested another discussion. We gathered again in the dining room, folders neatly arranged. "Mom," he began, "we think it would be wise to at least list the property and evaluate offers. There is no obligation to accept, but the market is strong." Vanessa added gently, "It would give you flexibility, freedom." Freedom. The words settled between us with rehearsed sincerity. I folded my hands on the table. "Freedom does not come from displacement," I said quietly. Daniel's jaw tightened. "No one is displacing you," he replied, though his eyes flickered toward the folders. I rose slowly and walked to the sideboard, where Edward had kept a silver letter opener. I ran my fingers along its cool surface before turning back to them. "Your father anticipated impatience," I said evenly. "He accounted for it." Vanessa's posture stiffened. "What does that mean?" she asked. I met her gaze steadily. "It means the structure is not as simple as you believe." Silence followed. Daniel looked from her to me, confusion replacing certainty. "Mom, what are you saying?" he asked. I did not answer immediately. Instead, I walked to the window overlooking the driveway and watched as a delivery truck passed slowly along the curb. Timing is not about anger. It is about inevitability. I turned back toward them, my voice calm and precise. "I am saying that no asset will be sold, no relocation will occur, and no action will be taken without my explicit consent." Vanessa's smile thinned. "Of course," she said, though the word carried tension. They believed they were negotiating. They did not yet understand that the negotiation had already concluded before it began, and I was ready to let the final terms speak for themselves when the moment arrived. The following morning, I requested that Daniel and Vanessa meet me in the study at precisely 10 o'clock. I chose the room deliberately. Edward had always believed that decisions carried more weight when made in the space where they were first imagined. Sunlight filtered through the tall windows, casting narrow lines across the polished desk. I stood beside the bookshelf when they entered, not seated behind the desk, not claiming authority, simply present. Vanessa offered a polite smile that did not conceal her impatience. Daniel looked tired, as though momentum had begun to press against him. "Is something wrong?" he asked. I gestured toward the chairs. "Please sit." My tone was steady, neither sharp nor warm. When they were seated, I walked to the desk and placed a sealed envelope in front of them. The paper was thick, the seal unbroken. Vanessa's eyes moved to it immediately. "What is this?" she asked. I rested my hands lightly on the back of Edward's leather chair. "An amendment," I replied. Daniel frowned. "To what?" I held his gaze. "To the trust." Silence settled into the room. It was not dramatic. It was heavy. I watched as Vanessa reached for the envelope, hesitated, then looked to Daniel for silent permission. He nodded, and she broke the seal carefully. The sound of paper sliding free was soft but final. As she read, the color in her face shifted almost imperceptibly. Daniel leaned closer, scanning the text line by line. I did not interrupt. I allowed the language to do its work. The amendment stated clearly that any attempt to initiate property liquidation, force relocation of the surviving spouse, or restructure core business holdings without unanimous consent would immediately transfer full controlling interest of the estate into a private trust managed solely by me. Furthermore, the amendment included documented acknowledgement from Edward that he had expressed concern regarding undue influence and premature financial maneuvering. The words were measured, precise, unambiguous. Daniel's brow tightened. "When was this signed?" he asked quietly. 3 weeks ago, I answered. Vanessa's voice was controlled but strained. "Why were we not informed?" I considered the question carefully. "Because the conditions had not yet been met," I replied. Daniel looked at me as though seeing a different version of his mother. "Are you saying that our discussions triggered this?" I did not raise my voice. "I am saying that your discussions confirmed your father's concerns." The room felt smaller, though nothing had physically changed. Vanessa closed the document slowly. "We were only trying to optimize the estate," she said. "Optimization without consent is assumption," I responded evenly. Daniel leaned back in his chair, the confidence he had carried for days now replaced with uncertainty. "What does this mean going forward?" he asked. I walked around the desk and sat in Edward's chair for the first time since his passing. The leather felt familiar beneath my hands. "It means the Weston property remains untouched," I said calmly. "It means business decisions require my approval. It means control has shifted." Vanessa inhaled sharply, but she did not argue. She understood the language. She understood the consequence. I folded my hands on the desk, my posture straight but relaxed. "Your father built this estate carefully," I continued. "He did not intend for it to become a vehicle for haste." Daniel lowered his eyes briefly. Vanessa remained very still. The power in the room did not rise. It settled. That was the difference. They had mistaken silence for surrender. They now understood it had been preparation. I stood slowly, signaling that the meeting was over. "We will move forward with clarity," I said. Neither of them responded immediately. They did not need to. The document on the table spoke with more authority than any raised voice ever could. The house was quieter after that meeting, but not peaceful. There is a difference. Silence born of respect feels steady. Silence born of recalculation feels tight. For 2 days, Daniel avoided prolonged conversation, leaving early for the office and returning after dinner. Vanessa remained polite, but her tone had shifted from confident to cautious. I noticed the way she measured her words now, how she no longer used phrases like strategic timing or market window. Precision had replaced ambition. On Thursday morning, I received a call from Mr. Caldwell, confirming that the amendment had been formally recorded and that the controlling trust provisions were now fully active. There would be no reversal without my consent. Legal clarity has a calming effect. I thanked him and ended the call before walking into the study where Daniel sat reviewing quarterly reports. He looked up immediately, as if expecting something. "The trust has been formally executed," I said evenly. He straightened in his chair. "So that is final?" he asked. "Yes," I replied. He nodded slowly, absorbing the weight of it. Vanessa appeared in the doorway moments later, having clearly heard enough to understand the direction of the conversation. "What does that mean operationally?" she asked. I folded my hands lightly in front of me. "It means all major financial decisions now require my written authorization. It means no property will be listed. It means the business will remain structured as your father intended." My tone did not rise. It did not need to. Vanessa held my gaze for several seconds before speaking again. "And if we disagree?" she asked. The question was calm, but etched. I met her eyes steadily. "Disagreement does not override ownership," I said. Daniel exhaled quietly, as though something inside him had finally settled. Later that afternoon, I convened a formal meeting with the senior leadership team of Whitmore Logistics via video conference from the study. I informed them that I would be serving as active trustee, and that Daniel would continue in his operational role under existing governance protocols. There was surprise on several faces, but also relief. Stability is valued in companies built over decades. When the call ended, Daniel remained seated across from me. "You planned this," he said softly. I considered the word. "Your father planned it," I corrected. I honored it. He nodded once, a mixture of understanding and humility crossing his expression. That evening, as the sun set beyond the tall pines lining the property, Vanessa approached me in the kitchen. The confidence she once carried had softened into something more measured. "I may have pushed too quickly," she said carefully. It was not an apology, but it was closer than anything she had offered before. I poured 2 glasses of water and handed one to her. "Ambition is not a flaw," I replied calmly, "but it must be balanced by respect." She accepted the glass without argument. In the days that followed, the atmosphere in the house shifted once more, not toward confrontation, toward clarity. The property appraisal documents disappeared from the dining table. The condominium listings were no longer discussed. Daniel resumed his work with renewed focus, this time consulting me before making structural decisions. Vanessa remained attentive, but the language of urgency had vanished from her vocabulary. I walked through the foyer one evening, pausing beneath the chandelier Edward had chosen himself. The light reflected softly against the marble floors, unchanged. Control had not been seized with anger. It had been reclaimed with precision. And as I stood there, listening to the quiet hum of the house that had witnessed every season of my marriage, I understood something simple and unshakable. Patience does not delay power. It defines it. The months that followed did not explode into drama or fracture into shouting matches. They settled into something quieter, more revealing. Daniel adjusted first. He began arriving at my study door before making significant decisions, carrying quarterly projections and expansion proposals with a new tone in his voice. It was no longer urgency, it was consultation. I reviewed each document carefully, asking measured questions about long-term stability rather than short-term gain. He listened. Sometimes he disagreed, but he did so respectfully. Authority reshapes posture. Vanessa changed more slowly. For several weeks, she remained distant, her politeness sharpened by restraint. But ambition without access eventually finds its boundaries. One afternoon, she joined me in the garden as I trimmed the rose bushes Edward had planted years ago. The late spring air carried the scent of fresh soil and early blooms. She stood beside me for a moment before speaking. "I underestimated you," she said quietly. It was not dramatic, it was not theatrical, it was honest. I continued trimming a stem before responding. "You misjudged silence," I said. She exhaled softly. "I thought you were grieving. I did not realize you were preparing." I met her eyes then, not with anger, but with clarity. "Grief and preparation are not opposites," I replied. That evening, I finalized the establishment of the Whitmore Foundation in Edward's name. A portion of the estate would fund scholarships for first-generation college students and support small business development programs across Massachusetts. Daniel reviewed the charter documents with visible pride. Vanessa read them more carefully, perhaps recognizing that legacy extends beyond liquidity. The Weston house remained unchanged. The appraisal documents were archived, not erased, simply filed where they belonged. Whitmore Logistics continued operating under steady governance, reporting quarterly to the trust. Stability replaced speculation. One Sunday afternoon, we gathered in the dining room for dinner, just the 3 of us. There were no folders on the table, no market analyses, no projections. Daniel carved the roast carefully, asking about the foundation's first scholarship cycle. Vanessa described a marketing initiative at the company, this time framed as a proposal rather than a declaration. I listened, contributing when necessary, observing always. The tension that once hovered over the table had dissolved into something more sustainable. Respect is not given, it is learned. Later that night, alone in the master bedroom, I opened the drawer where the brass key still rested. I did not need to use it anymore. The Second Amendment had already done its work. I sat at the edge of the bed and looked at Edward's photograph on the dresser. The wind in his hair from that anniversary cruise, the quiet confidence in his smile. He had known exactly what he was doing. He had understood that the greatest threat to legacy is not loss, it is haste. I turned off the bedside lamp and lay back against the pillows, listening to the familiar hum of the house settling around me. Nothing had been taken. Nothing had been forced. Control had simply been clarified. Daniel and Vanessa had believed the future belonged to speed and opportunity. I knew it belonged to patience and structure. In the end, there was no dramatic collapse, no public humiliation, no raised voices echoing through marble halls. There was only a shift, a recalibration. They learned that composure is not weakness, that preparation is not fear, that a widow who listens carefully can reshape the course of $28 million without ever raising her voice. And as sleep finally approached, I understood something even more valuable than inheritance. Dignity preserved is power retained.